Rain hammered the windshield so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown by an angry sky. The rental car fishtailed before Evan Cole finally brought it to a stop in the dim, muddy lot of a roadside motel in Ashford Ridge. His hands stayed locked on the steering wheel long after the engine died, knuckles white, jaw tight. Beside him sat Marianne Holt, his boss, still perfectly composed in her tailored coat, tapping once on her phone before realizing there was no signal left to tap for. Inside, the motel smelled like damp carpet and old coffee. A buzzing neon sign outside the office window flickered between red and dark. The elderly clerk barely looked up when he spoke. Storm filled the town. Only one room left. Evan's stomach dropped. One room. One night. With her. Marianne turned to him, calm, unreadable. "We'll manage," she said, as if this were a minor inconvenience instead of a professional nightmare. Evan forced a nod, but his chest tightened. Because if this night went on any longer, the truth he'd been hiding, the truth about why he looked so tired, why his phone kept lighting up, why failure terrified him, was going to come out. And once it did, he might lose far more than his job. Subscribe to Just Dad Things for more powerful single dad stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Evan Cole's mornings began long before the sun remembered to rise. The alarm went off at 4:30, but most days he was already awake, staring at the ceiling of the small rental house he and Lily had lived in since everything fell apart. The house wasn't much: thin walls, creaky floors, a heater that rattled like it might give up any winter. But it was safe. And safe was everything now. He moved quietly, the way you learn to move when a child's sleep feels sacred. Coffee first, cheap grounds strong enough to cut through the fog behind his eyes. Then lunches. One sandwich cut into triangles because Lily insisted they tasted better that way, apple slices brushed with lemon so they wouldn't turn brown, a folded note with a little star drawn in the corner. He never skipped the note. Even on the days his hands shook from exhaustion. Lily padded into the kitchen a little after 5, hair a mess of soft curls, wearing pajamas covered in planets that had been washed too many times. She always looked at him like he was the first good thing the day had offered. "Did you know," she said one morning, climbing onto her chair, "that some stars are already gone, but we still see their light?" Evan smiled, even though something in his chest tightened. "Yeah," he said, "I know." Lily was 7, curious and gentle, obsessed with space and drawing rockets that never ran out of fuel. Her drawings covered the fridge, the walls, sometimes even the back of Evan's work folders when she ran out of paper. She talked about becoming an astronaut, or a scientist, or sometimes just someone who discovers things. Evan told her she could be all of that. He just didn't know how he was going to afford it yet. By 6:30, they were in the car. By 7:15, she was at school. Evan waited until she was inside the building before driving away every single day. He watched until the doors closed, until she was out of sight. Only then did he exhale. Work was a different kind of survival. Evan was a junior account lead at a mid-sized firm, the kind of position that sounded more impressive than it felt. Long hours, high expectations, very little room for error. He dressed carefully, pressed shirts, neutral ties, shoes polished just enough to look intentional. No one at the office knew how often he skipped lunch to save money, or how close his bank account hovered to empty by the end of every month. Health insurance alone felt like a cliff edge. One slip, one termination, and Lily's doctor visits, her asthma inhaler, the safety net he clung to, it could all disappear overnight. Custody wasn't even a question, but stability was. Courts didn't like chaos. Neither did schools. Neither did children. His wife had died 3 years earlier. The words still felt unreal when he thought them. A sudden illness. A hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. A promise he'd made at her bedside to take care of Lily, no matter what. He carried that promise like a weight strapped to his ribs. People told him he was strong. He hated that word. Strong felt like something you were forced to be when there was no other option. So he didn't ask for favors, not from coworkers, not from managers, not from anyone. If Lily was sick, he made it work. If childcare fell through, he patched it together. If he was drowning, he learned how to hold his breath. At work, he smiled. He stayed late. He volunteered for projects no one else wanted. He answered emails at midnight and never complained about travel. He couldn't afford to be seen as unreliable, not when being reliable was the only thing keeping their life upright. At night, after Lily fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with bills spread out like quiet accusations. Rent, utilities, groceries, school supplies. There was never much left. Some months there was nothing. He thought about failure more than he admitted to himself. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind where the fridge grew emptier, the house grew colder, and Lily started noticing things he promised she never would. So when his boss asked him to join a high-stakes trip, he said yes without hesitation. Even when it meant rearranging childcare, even when it meant pushing himself harder than he should have. Because saying no felt dangerous. Saying yes felt like survival. Evan wasn't chasing promotions. He wasn't dreaming of corner offices or recognition. He just wanted Lily to feel safe, to wake up in the same bed, to keep drawing stars without worrying about the ground giving way beneath her. And that was why the idea of losing his job terrified him more than exhaustion ever could. Because if he lost, Lily lost too, and that was something he could never allow. Evan had known Marianne Holt's reputation long before he ever knew her voice. People talked about her in lowered tones in the office kitchen, the way you talk about storms you've survived or exams you barely passed. Director of Client Strategy. 15 years with the company. Turnaround specialist. The person they sent in when a deal was bleeding out and excuses stopped working. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her disappointment alone could clear a room. The first time Evan saw her in person, she was standing at the head of the conference table, jacket off, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest control without comfort. Her hair was pulled back neatly, not a strand out of place. She listened more than she spoke, eyes sharp, pen moving only when something mattered. When someone stumbled through an explanation, she let the silence stretch until the truth had nowhere left to hide. That was the woman sitting beside him in the rental car now. On the drive out of the city, Marianne barely looked up from her laptop. The failing client account was open on her screen charts, projections, notes layered with urgency. The company had poured months into it. If it collapsed, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be expensive. Careers had been quietly tied to its outcome. Evan did his best to stay focused, but his phone buzzed more than once in his pocket. He didn't check it. He couldn't. Every vibration tightened something behind his ribs. He answered questions when asked, offered data when needed, but he knew he wasn't at his sharpest. His thoughts drifted. His jaw stayed tense. Marianne noticed. She always did. She clocked the way he rubbed his temple when he thought no one was watching. The slight delay before he answered a question he normally would have nailed. The glance toward his phone when it buzzed again. None of it escaped her, and none of it impressed her. She didn't say anything. That was worse. In her world, commitment wasn't a suggestion. It was a baseline. You showed up ready, or you didn't show up at all. She had sacrificed weekends, relationships, and more sleep than she could count to get where she was. The job demanded it. The industry rewarded it. She'd learned early that sympathy rarely saved a sinking account. From her perspective, Evan was capable but unfocused, talented but divided. And division, in high-pressure situations, was dangerous. The power imbalance between them wasn't something Evan imagined. It lived in every pause, every carefully chosen word. Marianne didn't need to threaten him. Her presence alone carried consequence. She could elevate him or quietly mark him as someone who couldn't handle the heat. When the storm rolled in and traffic slowed to a crawl, Marianne closed her laptop with a sharp, controlled motion. She stared out at the darkening sky, jaw set. "This delay is a problem," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "I know," Evan replied quickly. "I'll adjust the timeline once we stop." She nodded once. No praise. No reassurance. As the rain intensified and the highway shut down entirely, the tension in the car thickened. Evan felt like he was being tested in ways he didn't fully understand. Not just on performance, but on composure. On priorities. He worried about what she saw when she looked at him. A liability. A question mark. Someone who might crack when pressure refused to ease. Marianne, for her part, felt the familiar frustration of depending on someone she wasn't sure she could trust. She didn't dislike Evan. She simply didn't know him. And in her experience, not knowing was a risk. By the time they pulled into the motel parking lot, the roles between them were firmly set. She was the authority. He was the subordinate. One controlled outcomes. The other lived at the mercy of them. Evan knew it. Marianne felt it. And neither of them realized yet how fragile that understanding was about to become. Because control, Evan had learned the hard way, was often an illusion. And storms had a way of stripping people down to whatever they were really made of. The motel lobby felt like a place time had forgotten. Water pooled just inside the door where guests tracked in rain from outside. A small television mounted in the corner muttered about flash flood warnings no one seemed to be listening to. The clerk slid a key across the counter with a tired hand, already bracing for complaints he didn't have the energy to answer. Evan took the key without a word. He didn't sigh. He didn't argue. He didn't look at Marianne to gauge her reaction. He simply accepted the reality in front of him and adjusted, the way he'd learned to do 100 times before. In the room, the overhead light flickered once, then steadied. 2 beds. One desk pushed against the wall. A lamp with a cracked shade. Evan set his bag down neatly and immediately pulled out his laptop. "The files didn't finish syncing," Marianne said, checking her screen. Her voice was tight, controlled. "The presentation deck is corrupted." Evan nodded. "I can rebuild it." The internet crawled, barely strong enough to load email. Evan tethered his laptop, rerouted the files, and rebuilt the slides from memory and backup screenshots. His fingers moved fast but steady, like someone who had learned to work under pressure without making it anyone else's problem. Outside, thunder cracked so loud the windows rattled. A woman down the hall knocked, panic in her voice. Her phone was dead. Her toddler was crying. The power flickered again. Evan stood up immediately. "I'll check the breaker," he said, already moving. He found the utility panel near the ice machine and reset the switch. When that didn't work, he found a flashlight at the front desk and walked the woman back to her room, kneeling down to the child's eye level, making silly shadow shapes on the wall until the crying stopped. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't look back for approval. Marianne watched from the doorway, not because she meant to, because it was hard not to. When Evan returned, rain dripping from his jacket, he went right back to work. No commentary, no frustration. He handed Marianne a rebuilt deck, cleaner than the original, with clearer visuals and a sharper narrative flow. "You reorganized the middle section," she said, scanning the slides. "It was redundant," Evan replied simply. "This version tells the story faster." She looked at him then. Really looked, not as an employee filling a seat, but as someone thinking. They worked side by side at the small desk, shoulders careful not to touch, papers spread out, coffee cups growing cold. Evan made suggestions quietly, framing them as options, never insisting. Each one was thoughtful. Each one improved the strategy. He stayed calm when the lights flickered again, stayed focused when his phone buzzed unanswered in his pocket. Stayed steady. Marianne had seen confidence before. Loud, polished confidence that demanded attention. What she hadn't seen in a long time was this: competence without ego. Problem solving without performance. "You're not flustered," she said finally. Evan shrugged. Doesn't help. That was all. As the storm howled outside, Marianne realized something unsettling. The man she'd quietly judged as distracted was carrying far more than she'd assumed. And instead of letting it break him, he'd learned how to adapt, how to show up fully without making his burden anyone else's responsibility. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't seek reassurance. He just did the work. Respect didn't arrive all at once. It didn't need to. It settled in slowly, quietly, the way trust often does, unannounced but undeniable. And for the first time since the trip began, Marianne wasn't wondering whether Evan could handle the pressure. She was wondering how much pressure he'd already survived. The power went out without warning. 1 second the lamp cast a dull yellow circle across the desk, and the next the room dropped into darkness so complete it felt physical. Thunder cracked almost simultaneously, close enough to rattle the window panes and set off a car alarm somewhere in the lot. The hum of electricity vanished, replaced by the heavy sound of rain and wind battering the building. Marianne froze. Evan didn't. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on before the echo of thunder fully faded. The beam swept the room, steady and controlled. He set it upright on the desk so it lit their workspace, then checked the hallway through the door crack to make sure no one needed help again. "Town-wide outage," the clerk called from somewhere down the hall. "Could be a while." Evan nodded to himself and closed the door. Phones were next. Evan glanced at his screen. 8% battery, no signal. He winced slightly and slid it back into his pocket, forcing himself to focus on what was still in front of him. He lit the small emergency candle from the nightstand and placed it between their laptops, its flame flickering with every gust of wind outside. In the candlelight, the room felt smaller, quieter, more honest. Marianne leaned back in her chair, arms crossed loosely, eyes reflecting the flame. Without the harsh overhead light, without the constant pings of emails and notifications, something about her seemed less distant, less armored. They worked in silence for a few minutes, reviewing notes by flashlight and candle glow. Evan adjusted phrasing, restructured a slide verbally so Marianne could jot it down. He was focused, but the tension in his shoulders had crept higher. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. This time, he couldn't ignore it. He pulled it out, hesitated, then listened to the voicemail before the battery could die. His sister's voice came through the speaker, thin and rushed. "Evan, it's Lily." She woke up crying. "She can't breathe right, and she keeps asking for you. I gave her the inhaler, but she's panicking. Please call me back." The message ended. The screen went black. For a moment, Evan didn't move. The room felt too quiet, the storm outside too loud. His chest tightened, hard and fast, like a fist closing around his lungs. He swallowed once, then again, trying to steady himself. Marianne watched him carefully. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice lower now. Not managerial, human. Evan laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "No," he said. "It's not." He sat down on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the dead phone in his hands. The exhaustion he'd been holding back all day finally caught up to him. His shoulders sagged. The careful professionalism slipped just enough. "My daughter," he said quietly. "She's 7. Lily." He paused, jaw tightening. "She has asthma. Storms scare her. She thinks, if I'm not there, something bad will happen." Marianne didn't interrupt. "I'm a single dad," Evan continued, the words tumbling out now that the door had cracked open. "My wife passed away 3 years ago. It was sudden. Since then, it's just been the two of us." He ran a hand through his hair, fingers trembling slightly. "I didn't want to mention it. Not on this trip. Not ever, really. I didn't want it to sound like an excuse." An excuse. The word tasted bitter. "I know how it looks," he went on. "The phone calls, the distractions. I know this account matters. I know you're counting on me. And I am committed. I can't turn off being her dad. Not even when I try." His voice broke on the last word. He pressed his lips together, breathing slowly through his nose, fighting the urge to stand up and pace. Fighting the helplessness that came with being miles away when his child needed him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, not looking up. "I should have handled this better. I just didn't want you to think I couldn't do the job." The candle flickered. The storm roared on. Marianne stayed silent for several seconds, and each one felt like a verdict hanging in the air. Evan braced himself for disappointment, for the quiet recalculation, for the mental note that said liability. Instead, she spoke carefully. "You thought telling me would cost you." Evan nodded once. "Yes. Why?" He looked up then, eyes tired and honest. "Because I've seen what happens to people who admit they have limits. They stop getting opportunities. They stop being trusted, and I can't afford that." His voice softened. "Not when someone else depends on me for everything." Marianne leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk. The candlelight traced the lines of concentration on her face. "You're not unreliable," she said. "You're overwhelmed." Evan let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I don't need special treatment," he said quickly. "I just needed to explain. I'll fix whatever needs fixing. I always do." "I know," Marianne replied. And that was when Evan realized something had shifted. She wasn't evaluating him anymore. She was listening. The storm outside felt distant now, muted by the quiet intensity of the room. In the soft light, stripped of titles and expectations, Evan sat exposed in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. This wasn't just about a presentation or a job. This was about the fear that had followed him since the hospital room, since the promise he'd made, the fear that no matter how hard he worked, it might still not be enough. And now, sitting there with his boss in a dark motel room, that fear had finally been spoken aloud. Whether it would cost him everything or change everything, he didn't yet know. When the words finally ran out, the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm had. Evan sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles ached. The candle between them burned low, its flame unsteady, as if it too were running out of strength. Outside, the rain softened from a roar to a steady rhythm, the worst of the storm slowly moving on without him. Inside, everything felt broken. "I'm sorry," Evan said again, quieter this time. The word felt useless now, worn thin from overuse. "I shouldn't have let this spill into work. I know better. I should have planned differently." Marianne didn't respond. She sat still at the desk, posture straight, face unreadable in the dim light. Not angry. Not kind. Just quiet. And that quiet terrified him more than any raised voice could have. Evan's mind raced ahead, filling in the gaps with worst-case futures. He saw the meeting tomorrow going badly. He saw Marianne's polite but distant follow-up weeks later. He saw his name quietly removed from important projects. No confrontation. No drama. Just a slow fading out. He imagined the email. "We've decided to move in a different direction." The house was the first thing to go in his thoughts. Then the insurance. Then the routines he'd worked so hard to build for Lily. The school she loved. The teacher who understood her anxiety. The bedroom walls covered in stars. He pressed his palms into his knees, grounding himself. "I understand if this changes things," he said, voice low. "I won't argue. I just wanted you to know why I wasn't at my best." Still nothing. The candle flickered, then steadied again. The room smelled faintly of melted wax and damp fabric. Evan focused on those details because if he let his thoughts wander, he was afraid he might not pull himself back. He replayed Lily's voice in his head, her panic, the way she needed him, and he hadn't been there. Guilt layered on top of fear until his chest felt tight again. He'd always believed That if he just worked harder, sacrificed more, stayed quiet about his struggles, everything would eventually even out. That responsibility would be rewarded. That the system would notice effort. But sitting there now, stripped of excuses and defenses, he felt foolish for ever believing it. He had done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Marianne finally stood, crossing the room slowly. Evan tensed, bracing for the end. For the professional distance to snap back into place. Instead, she stopped a few feet away and looked out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Her reflection wavered in the darkness. "This job," she said at last, her voice measured, "doesn't leave much room for messiness." Evan nodded. "I know. I built my career around that idea," she continued. "Control, predictability, sacrifice." She paused. "It's what I was taught to value." Evan swallowed, unsure where this was going. Hope felt dangerous now. He didn't want to reach for it and come up empty. "I don't expect exceptions," he said quietly. "I just needed to be honest." Marianne turned back to him. Her expression hadn't softened, but something in her eyes had shifted. Not pity, not judgment. Recognition. "You think honesty makes you weak," she said. He didn't answer, because the truth was written all over his face. She didn't say anything else after that. Instead, she returned to the desk, gathering the papers into a neat stack. The conversation, whatever it was becoming, seemed to close in on itself again. Evan felt the last of his energy drain away. He lay back on the bed fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling fan that no longer moved. His body felt heavy, like gravity had increased just for him. The adrenaline that had carried him through the storm finally burned out, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. He thought about Lily again, about how she trusted him to always come back, about how much she believed in him. "I'll fix this," he whispered to the empty room. Somehow. But the words didn't carry the same confidence they once had. As the storm faded into the distance and the motel grew quiet, Evan lay there listening to the hum of the building settling, feeling smaller than he had in years. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd finally admitted how much he had been carrying alone. And in that stillness, with no power, no signal, and no certainty waiting on the other side of morning, Evan truly believed he had crossed a line he could never uncross. That by telling the truth, he had finally lost everything he was trying so desperately to protect. Morning came quietly, almost apologetically. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the town washed clean and oddly peaceful. Pale sunlight slipped through the motel curtains, touching the edge of the desk, the empty coffee cups, the stack of papers they'd salvaged the night before. Evan woke with a dull ache behind his eyes and the heavy certainty that nothing had actually been fixed. He checked his phone the moment he had signal again. 3 missed calls, 2 texts. 1 voicemail. Lily was okay. His sister said the inhaler had helped, that Lily had finally fallen asleep asking when her dad would be home. Evan closed his eyes and pressed the phone to his forehead, relief and guilt crashing into each other so hard it made him dizzy. They drove to the client's office in near silence. Marianne was back in full professional mode, hair neat, posture precise, expression carefully neutral. If anything had changed between them the night before, it didn't show. Evan told himself that was a good thing. It meant the line hadn't been crossed, or maybe it meant it had, and this was the correction. The conference room was already full when they arrived, executives in pressed suits. Laptops open, coffee steaming. The kind of room where reputations were quietly weighed and adjusted. Evan took his seat, hands folded in front of him, heart thudding harder with every passing second. The presentation began smoothly. The rebuilt deck landed exactly the way it needed to. Nods around the table, notes taken. Evan allowed himself to breathe, just a little. Then the senior vice president leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Evan. "I do have one concern," he said, voice calm but sharp. "There were delays yesterday. Missed calls. Some gaps in responsiveness. For an account this critical, we need absolute commitment. Can you assure us that won't be an issue going forward?" The room went still. Evan opened his mouth, already rehearsing the careful, apologetic response he'd perfected over years of survival. He would own the mistake. He would promise improvement. He would make himself smaller if that was what it took. He never got the chance. "That won't be necessary," Marianne said. Every head at the table turned toward her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't soften it either. She placed her hands flat on the table, grounding herself, and met the executive's gaze without flinching. "The delays yesterday were the result of circumstances beyond Evan's control," she continued. "And more importantly, they don't reflect a lack of commitment. They reflect the reality that the person you're questioning carries responsibilities that don't disappear just because a meeting is scheduled." Evan's pulse thundered in his ears. Marianne went on. "Evan Cole is one of the most consistent, capable professionals on my team. He rebuilt this entire presentation under emergency conditions, supported others during a storm, and still delivered a clearer strategy than what we started with." She paused, letting that settle. "He is also a single father," she said plainly, "and his dedication to his child doesn't diminish his value here. It strengthens it." A ripple moved through the room, not shock exactly, but recalibration. Marianne didn't stop. "We talk constantly about resilience, responsibility, and leadership," she said. "This is what it looks like. Showing up fully. Solving problems without excuses. Carrying weight without asking for applause." She turned slightly, gesturing toward Evan. "If you want someone who understands stakes, consequences, and long-term thinking, you're looking at him." Silence followed. Heavy. Intentional. The executive cleared his throat. "I wasn't aware." "You didn't need to be," Marianne said evenly. "What you needed to know was whether the work would be done." It was, and it will continue to be. Evan sat frozen, chest tight, eyes burning. He hadn't realized how much he'd expected to be left alone in that moment, until he wasn't. The executive nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "Let's continue." The meeting moved on, but something fundamental had shifted. Evan felt it in the way people looked at him now, not with doubt, with respect. When it ended, the room emptied gradually. Conversations resumed. Laptops closed. The world kept turning. Evan stayed seated until Marianne touched his arm lightly. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded, though his voice came out rough. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," she said simply, "I did." They stood together in the now empty room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bright and honest. "I won't apologize for telling the truth," Marianne added. "And I won't allow someone's humanity to be used against them, not on my watch." Evan swallowed hard. "Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. Professional. Grounded. Certain. As they walked out, Evan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not victory, but dignity. For the first time, the truth hadn't cost him everything. It had protected him. The change didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic announcement, no sweeping email that reset Evan's life overnight. Instead, it came quietly, the way real stability often does, through small, deliberate decisions that added up to something solid. A week after the trip, Marianne asked Evan to step into her office. Not for a reprimand. Not for a review. She closed the door, gestured for him to sit, and slid a single-page document across the desk. "It's a proposal," she said, "not a favor." Evan read it slowly, afraid to skim, afraid to miss something important. Creative strategy led. Reduced travel. Clear boundaries around after-hours work. A role built around what he did best, seeing the story inside the data, shaping ideas instead of constantly reacting to emergencies. "This position needs someone who thinks the way you do," Marianne continued, "and someone who understands long-term impact. That matters." Evan looked up. "I don't want special treatment." "This isn't special treatment," she replied calmly. "It's alignment." He accepted. The difference showed almost immediately. Mornings no longer felt like races against collapse. Evan still woke early, but now there was room to breathe. He walked Lily to school more often. He stayed long enough to hear about her day before she ran off to class. At night, he was home in time for homework questions and stories that wandered in unexpected directions. Lily noticed before anyone else. "You don't look so tired anymore," she said one evening as they worked on a school project together. Cardboard rockets, aluminum foil windows, stars cut unevenly from construction paper. "I feel less tired," Evan admitted. Her asthma episodes became less frequent. The nighttime panic faded as routine returned. She slept better. So did he. At work, something shifted too. Evan spoke up more in meetings, not louder but with confidence. His ideas were heard. His contributions recognized. The quiet respect he'd earned during the storm followed him back into the office. Marianne kept their relationship professional, but there was a new ease between them. Conversations that once ended strictly at deadlines now stretched into thoughtful exchanges about approach, ethics, balance. They disagreed sometimes, they listened always. They didn't rush anything. Trust grew slowly, intentionally. One afternoon, Marianne asked about Lily's latest school project. Another time, Evan noticed Marianne eating lunch alone and joined her without pretense. They talked about work, then, eventually, about life. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt hidden. Evan realized something important in those weeks. The fear that had driven him for years, the belief that honesty would destroy everything, had loosened its grip. He hadn't become careless. He hadn't stopped working hard. He had simply stopped pretending he was invincible, and the world hadn't collapsed. It had adjusted. One night, as Evan tucked Lily into bed, she wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "I like when you're home." He closed his eyes, holding her just a second longer. "Me too." Across town, Marianne sat alone in her apartment, reviewing notes for a new project. She paused, staring out the window, thinking about the night at the motel. About the assumptions she'd made, about the choices she'd been taught to prioritize. Change, she realized, didn't always come from ambition. Sometimes it came from witnessing someone carry responsibility with quiet courage. The bond between them remained careful, rooted in respect rather than expectation. Two people who had seen each other clearly at a moment when there was nowhere left to hide. And that, Evan understood now, was enough. For the first time since his wife's death, his life felt steady. Not perfect, but grounded. Built not on fear of loss, but on the confidence that he could show up fully, both as a professional and as a father, without sacrificing one for the other. That balance, hard-won and fragile, was the real victory. And it was one he intended to protect. The house was quiet in the way Evan had learned to treasure. The dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Not the kind that carried fear with it, just a steady rhythm that felt almost comforting. Evan sat at the small table with Lily, 2 mugs of hot chocolate between them, steam curling upward as she carefully traced stars on a piece of paper with a silver marker. "This one's you," she said, pointing to a bright cluster she'd drawn near the corner. "And this one's me. We're close so we don't get lost." Evan smiled, his chest tightening in that familiar, gentle way. He helped her rinse her mug, then walked her down the hallway to her room. The glow in the dark stars on her ceiling were already shining, scattered in patterns only she understood. He tucked the blanket around her shoulders, smoothing her hair back. She yawned, then looked at him seriously. "Dad," she asked, "do storms always change things?" Evan paused. For a moment, he thought about the motel. The darkness, the fear, the truth he'd been too tired to keep hidden. Then he thought about the mornings now, walking Lily to school, laughing over burnt toast, feeling present instead of braced for impact. "Not always," he said softly, "but sometimes they show you what matters." Lily nodded, satisfied with that answer. I'm glad that storm happened, she murmured, already half asleep. Evan stayed there a while after her breathing evened out, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet. His life wasn't perfect. Bills still came. Work still demanded effort. Some days were still heavy. But it was safe, and safe, he had learned, was enough to build something beautiful on. He turned off the light and stood in the doorway, taking one last look at his daughter before heading down the hall. The night felt different now. Not fragile, not threatening. Just open. Some detours didn't ruin you. Some of them rerouted you exactly where you needed to be. And if this story touched you, subscribe to Just Dad Things for more single dad stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.